Alright, g'day IB psychologists. In this video, we're going to look at the first lesson in the Stress for IB Health Psychology unit, What is Stress? Before we study it, we have to know what it is. This is actually a surprisingly difficult question to answer. And we can see in our stress unit, these are all the topics. We're going to start right here with what is stress. Also, we're going to talk about why stress is difficult to define and why it's difficult to measure. This is going to set a really good foundation for the rest of the studies on stress. So first, let's talk about why it's difficult to define. First of all, stress covers such a wide range of experiences. When we say, I'm so stressed, that means different things to different people. And so that's one reason. Another reason is we all have our own subjective definitions and understandings of what stress means. And even psychologists struggle to come up with a universal definition. Another really important reason why stress is difficult to define is because we could be talking about any one of three things. First of all, we could say, I'm under so much stress. We're talking about stresses, the things that stress us out. Exams, work, deadlines, relationships. These are anything that stresses you out as a stressor. And so when we say, I'm feeling stressed or I'm under stress, what we mean is we have a lot of stresses. The other thing is it also involves a psychological component, right? I mean, stress is largely in the mind, and we think we're going to look at this in future lessons and videos about appraisals. But there's a psychological element to stress, right? We think, oh, I feel so stressed. It's what's buzzing around in our minds. And then finally, we can't escape the physiological aspects of stress, the fight or flight response. And so when we say I'm feeling stressed or I am stressed, it's any one of those three things. I've got a lot of stresses, it's in my mind is whirring, and my body, my heart's racing, and I'm just feeling physically stressed out. And this is why it's really tricky to define, because when we talk about stress, well, which one of these things are we talking about? So a good definition, when you're trying to think of what is a good definition, it would include those three things. So the most common definition of stress is that it occurs when we experience a threatening stimulus. So this is a stressor. So stress occurs when we are in a situation that is perceived as threatening and that we feel like we can't cope with it. This is the psychological appraisal aspect we'll get to in future videos. And finally, this feeling of feeling threatened and in a situation we can't cope leads to a physiological response or even an emotional and behavioral response as well. Okay, so a good definition is stress is when we experience something we feel is beyond our ability to cope and which produces a physiological response. Okay, so there I think we've incorporated all of those aspects of stress. If you can really master that definition, it's going to really help you. If you're writing about stress for IB Health Psychology, in any essay, you're going to want to have a very succinct, concise definition. So I really like this one, right? Try to figure it out, put it in your own words. But stress is when we encounter a situation, right, which we feel is threatening and we don't feel like we have the resources to cope, and that produces a physiological response. Okay. Now, why is it difficult to measure? Well, it's that same problem, really. What are we measuring? Are we measuring how many stresses we're under? Are we measuring our appraisals, our subjective feelings of stress, what's happening in our mind, how we're thinking and feeling? Or are we measuring the physiological stress response? And so that's the same reason why it's difficult to define is often why it's difficult to measure. So how do psychologists measure stress? Well, there's two really common ways. First of all, you'll read about and you'll learn about a lot of studies in this unit that use the Perceived Stress Scale, the PSS. This is a questionnaire that will give you a score out of 40, and it gives an indication of how stressed you are. From memory, I should have written down what the exact scores are. I think it's somewhere over 17, over in the 20s and above is considered quite high stressed. Right? So that's the most common way of measuring what we call subjective stress, right? Perceived stress. Now, physiological levels are really common. Probably the most common way is through cortisol levels. This is the hormone released when we feel stressed. Morning cortisol levels are a good indicator of your chronic stress. So if you have very high cortisol levels in the morning, it suggests that you have high stress, because actually cortisol should be lowest in the morning, and then our cortisol levels gradually increase during the day. We sleep and they reset. Blood pressure is another really good way and another common way psychologists measure stress. I never used to worry about my blood pressure, but now anytime I get a chance, stick it in the machine, push the button, it's a good indicator. 1010/65 yesterday in the pharmacy was my blood pressure. I think that's okay. Actually, it's pretty good. And finally, I mean, heart rate isn't a great measure. We're going to look at some studies that measure cardiac output, and this is the volume of blood pumped from the heart. Now, actually, this is not really a measure of stress per se, but actually your stress response, and then how your body's responding to the stress. Again, we'll talk about that more in future videos and lessons. All right. Just to quickly tap on the stress response, if you've studied this in other units like in criminology or biological psychology, you might already be familiar with the HPA axis, but a quick refresher. So often when we feel stressed, it's the amygdala, which sends a signal to the hypothalamus saying, let's activate that fight or flight response. The HPA, right, is the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal gland. So the hypothalamus sends a signal to the pituitary gland, which then sends the signal to the adrenal glands, and it's from the adrenal glands which the cortisol and adrenaline is released, and that sparks the fight or flight response. Now, this is really important to know when we talk about the links between stress and other health problems like cardiovascular disease and other physical health problems. So we can see here, the brain, the hypothalamus, our adrenal glands release the stress hormones, and then we have these physiological changes, right? Our blood pressure increases, our heart rate goes up, etc., etc. Okay, so quick definition there. Remember, stress is when we encounter a situation that we feel like is beyond our ability to cope, and also produces a physiological stress response. We're going to break that definition down even further in the next lessons on appraisals. And just a reminder, here are some resources that might help you with this. We have the ebook, the revision guidebook, example essays, flashcards, the audiobook, the first ever time I've made an audiobook that goes with the readings for this. Or if you are a student, you might want to let your teacher know about this. This is available. But if you're a teacher, here it is. Although chances are, if you're watching this video, you already know about it. Don't forget, we've got the blog and to the YouTube, and subscribe, all that jazz there as well. I hope that was a nice, gentle introduction to stress. If that stressed you out, just defining what is stress, well, you're not alone. I had to write that lesson at the end after doing all the other research on stress because, well, no one agrees on what stress is, and it was a little bit more confusing than I thought. But there we have it. Stresses, the stress response, and appraisals, those three things make up stress.